Okay, so let's start now. We have 5 presentations, and the first one will be a presentation from Anna Maria Siewierska on competition and innovation in digital markets, interference of the intellectual property law and the competition law in tech giants' activities. And Anna is College of Europe alumnus and a PhD candidate at the Doctoral School of Social Sciences Legal Studies at the University of Warsaw. So once again, your talk will be 10 minutes long, or maybe a little less if you want to give more room for discussion, but the whole thing must be 15 minutes. Okay? Are you with us, Anna? Yes, would you share your screen? So once again, I will tell you when it's 5 minutes and 1 minute, okay?
Okay.
So the virtual floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for this kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to briefly start my presentation. The aim of my presentation is to outline the interference of the intellectual property law and the competition law business models where IP rights receive. My presentation will be structured as firstly, consumers' attention market and business models created around this idea will be briefly analyzed. Law. Thirdly, the analysis of the usage of the IP rights advantage of the biggest companies and its impact on the users of the platform will be provided. My research is trying to find the answers for the following questions. Preliminary.
Anna, can you hear me, Anna?
Above mentioned companies can abuse their market position by accessing relevant information devices. Hello, can you hear me? Is there any problem?
Yes,
hello?
Anna, we cannot, the connection is not that good. Would you have a way to improve your connection?
Oh, I don't know. Can you hear me now?
That's a little better.
We can hear you, but maybe you can do it with only audio, not with video.
Okay.
Yeah.
Try now.
Is it okay now? Can you hear
Yes.
me?
Yes, it's better. Thank you.
Okay, so here you can see my main questions, and the preliminary results of the research indicated that above companies can use their market position by using market entry barriers, preventing competitors from accessing relevant information, devices, data, or resources by integrating services in neighboring markets using intellectual property rights and monopolies. To start with, new business models, it should be noted that Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google have replaced oil and gas and telecommunications firms among the top 10 global companies based on the market capitalization in 2018. This means that tech giants have challenged the current approach to doing business at all and conducting competition policy as well. So far, the goal of a private company was maximizing profits. The new business models operating on the platform are offering a different perspective. In the short to medium term, they prioritize growth and number of users over economic gains, even if such actions leeway to incur losses. Instruments which can lead to obtain such dominance are different, starting from data usage and computer algorithms, ending with innovative business solutions. Firstly, let's try to define this specific market. In the literature, different definitions are used to designate an area of business that is based on new technologies, is the new economy, the digital economy, and the market for communication and information technologies, ICT market. And regardless of the term used, it is more often correlated with essentially free markets: computer programs, software, computer equipment, hardware, telecommunications networks, and e-commerce, internet technologies and services. What is more, technology companies have launched the new way of doing business, the platform, and here you can see the definition given by the European Commission. And traditional competitive abuse is associated with price competition and increasing shares in the same or higher level of the markets. In the digital economy, however, the relationship between horizontal dominance and harm to consumers is much more complex. The mutual relationship between the platform and the entrepreneur is usually shaped so that the platform is on the upstream market, while the platform-related new product operates on the downstream market. As a result, on this market, the platform operator competes with users on its platform. This means that from the one side, the company would like to use the platform to promote its services. On the other, it should protect products from the anti-competitive behavior of the biggest player. This creates, for example, a problem how to create property rights in an algorithm that is constantly changing, and then when make this algorithm available for the competitors, or how to protect the inventor and in the same time how to promote further technology growth in the competition-friendly environment. It should be noted that intellectual property rights protection can be used to create a competitive advantage not only over real competitors, but also in some cases over companies' users and clients. And let's have a closer look on this IP and competition law relation. Intellectual property rights and competition law have been compared to an unhappy marriage. While the first one ought to foster monopolies, the latter is in principle opposing them. The relation is even more complicated in the area of innovation and technology sector, where exploitation of intellectual property rights strongly affect competition rules. And historically, the fundamental aim of the intellectual property law framework have always been to encourage new technologies and promote creative works. Rules are designated mainly to create a sustainable economic basis for invention and creation. While the goal of IP is quite similar in the international perspective, goals of competition law vary depending on the system. In the US competition law, for example, regulations enacted antitrust laws to rein in the power of industrial trust that had emerged in the late 19th century, focusing on promoting and protecting competition. In the EU, competition law serves two goals of the single European market, the competition goal and the integrational goal.
That's 5 minutes, Anna.
Okay, thank you. It can be presumed that there is no conflict between those disciplines. Intellectual property law promotes technical progress and innovation. Competition law protects fair competition, which is the driving force of the market economy. Both goals resulting in the consumer welfare, higher quality products, and a lower price. However, it should be noted that price does not play such a significant role on the new technology markets, as it does in most sectors of the economy. Here, the most important thing is to provide consumers with the most technologically advanced product possible. In such situations, intellectual property rights are necessary for competition to occur. It should be underlined that intellectual property rights can undertake basically all actions that are not prohibited by competition law. Therefore, competition law is interested in the effects of the authorized entities' activities from the market and competition point of view. As a result, it seems justified that competition protection authorizers may intervene by imposing remedies to protect the market, for example, a compulsory license. After all, both of those areas protect a different category of entities. Intellectual property law protects the interest of the individual by securing profits from the creative activities. Competition law, on the other hand, protects the general interest, which includes the efficient and effective market with fair competition. In my paper, I'm also analyzing some cases, and I've chosen Google an example of using APIs, and the case is about that Google copied Oracle's Java API code to implement its Android system. In consequence, Oracle, which owns the code, sued Google for the violation of copyright law. according to the US law, software code falls under copyright laws, and Google use was illegal. On this stage of the case. What are the potential ramifications if Oracle wins? In the long run, any API will effectively lock out any second source software. That's because the first one to create API will own the copyright for not only the API definition, but almost any implementation that would support it. And I'm analyzing this issue in my paper. Another example is Google Authors Guild case, and it's called the most important precedents for the field of artificial intelligence and machine learning. The case debates briefly the legal right for Google to use copyrighted books and its train its Google Books search algorithm. The legal ramification of these precedents could have far-reaching consequences too. The decision formally allow companies to use copyrighted material in the development of deep learning algorithms, largely because the use of this does not directly affect the earnings of the individual articles under the copyright. On the other hand, we can remember the EU approach, which is more strict. In the recent cases, Microsoft, Google, for example, the Commission is imposing huge fines on the competitors. So it's a quite opposite approach than we can observe in the US. And conclusions which I'm making is that technology revolutions has changed not only the shape of digital markets, but foremost the consumers' and entrepreneurs' reality, rights, obligations, and business relations. Also, the business model of online platforms cause many conflicts of interests, mainly because their attitude to enter new neighboring markets during the process of development. Assessing the platform's role, competition law and intellectual property law requires the analysis of the both sides of the platform, the client, entrepreneur, and the platform itself. What should be evident from this is that the issues posed by big tech do not fall neatly within the competition law area. Other areas of law will also come into play to address these distinct problems: data protections and privacy laws, corporate taxation rules, as well as other sector-specific legislation. And where the conduct is anti-competitive, competition law steps in. Essentially, competition law deals with the competition concerns of these broad issues.
So you need to conclude, ma'am. Thank you.
And do I have a time, or it's I'm done?
Just please conclude now.
Let me ask one question as the final question, because it is difficult to argue that the tech giants are anti-competitive when the products they offer are essentially free or very cheap. Thus, maybe competition law should also take into consideration broader policy goals like decentralization, priorities like smaller and local businesses, or even environmental and social considerations.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
Now we open the discussion. Do we have a member that would have a question or an observation? We have 5 minutes. No question. Anna, may I ask something about your conclusion? So you are saying that we need broader policy goals. Does your paper elaborate on one of these goals?
Of course. I was thinking about maybe let's analyze prioritizing smaller and local businesses. So maybe there is okay to give them some kind of legal advantage over big tech companies. I'm not telling now about only big tech tax, yes, which is the idea, but maybe we can think about other instruments, and because this game isn't fair for them because they are smaller, they don't have an access to the market. So maybe maybe this is the area where we should start, not the competition law at all, but maybe laws of smaller companies and such the regulations.
And do you think we have a legal tool to improve their position on the market?
I think it's a broad conclusion, and
Yeah.
I think for now we don't have such a tool.
Okay.
But maybe taking also into account the social considerations, we can impose some maybe some goals concerning privacy or yeah.
Oliver, you have a question.
Yeah, maybe it's more a comment than a question. But I would recommend, as an economist, I logically would recommend to look into economics. And in this specific case, I think if this is work in progress and you are going to develop that, then I think you should have a look into the newer literature on platforms, which discusses a lot under which conditions platforms can be in competition and under which conditions one platform is likely to dominate. And I think that could be very helpful to get more precise on the goals and also on what is achievable with platform competition and what cannot be achieved by platform competition. So this could be a way to further develop that. Issues like network effects, direct and indirect, but also compatibility. And also all the discussion of self-preferencing and so on. So a clearer analysis of under which market conditions the dangerous stuff is really going to appear, and how market conditions can look like, where the benefits, which you also emphasized rightfully, can be enjoyed.
Yeah,
Thank you, Oliver. Maria, you have a short question, please. You have a
yes,
question.
my very short question would be only that I remember that with the Microsoft case, there was this discussion that we are a little bit drifting away from the protection of competitors, protection of competition towards protection of competitors. And it was criticized, of course. And now I don't know whether, adding an additional goals to competition law would not be criticized as well in this like under this thinking. So it was just like whether maybe you also thought about that or discussed that.
Maybe a short comment, Anna?
Yeah, I also thought about that adding any other requirements to the competition goals may cause a problem, because as I told you, the effects of big tech companies' activities are beneficial for the consumers and clients, and the products offered by them is cheap or even given for free. So yes, I agree. It can be problematic to put another sorry, I lost the word, but yes, I agree with you.
We got you. Thank you very much, Anna. Maria, you are assistant professor at Institute of European Law, Faculty of Law in Slovakia, in Bratislava, right?
Yes, that's correct.
You give lectures at the Faculty of Law of your university in Bratislava, and in 2019 you were lecturing in Strasbourg. So we can talk French, right?
Un peu.
Sorry, you're going to your talk is on employment of algorithms in cartels, and the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful conference. I must pay tribute to all the organizers, because I think it's one of the best conferences I've ever attended. So thank you so much. And today I would like to share with you my thoughts on the employment of algorithms in cartels, and whether we are not a little bit drifting away from objective liability within competition law. I will focus on one particular type of cartels, and that's the bid rigging. And I will think of the challenges which are brought by employment of pricing algorithms in bid rigging, and whether the proof of intention is not needed more than ever before. So just a few words about bid rigging, because I think everybody knows that it's a type of cartel and it's prohibited by 101 as well as by all the national competition acts, as the one in Slovakia. In general, it's considered to be by object agreement. As any other cartel, it's very difficult to spot, and we have to use some different tools to spot these cartels. For instance, the algorithms can be used also in this way as to help the competition authorities to find or identify the markets or the sectors which are a little bit fishy, and then to scrutinize them. So so they are a little bit double-edged weapon, let's say. Okay, bid rigging. So cartels in public procurements, they are a little bit more deplorable than the rest of the cartels, because not only the goal of competition is ruined, also the effective spending of public money is ruined. And it's something which should really concern us, because we are the taxpayers. So it's also my money which is not effectively used. And these cartels can take various forms, from rotation of bids to cover bids. There can be division of market and so on. And yeah, let's see how the algorithms work here. So basically, algorithms are used vastly when private parties procure some things for themselves, and of course they use it as their pricing, or for their pricing as well. And algorithms are not always bad, but they can also serve as a tool for collusion, and this is something what I am trying to discuss here. So apart from the algorithms, we also have to think of the digitalized markets, which, as we discussed throughout these 3 days, they have many pro-competitive implications, but of course there are so many anti-competitive implications. I will mention just one, and that's the availability of data and the way how the data can be harvested, it can be analyzed, and by application of a little bit self-learning algorithms, this can lead to really unprecedented consequences. This thinking about algorithms as a type of or as a facilitation for cartel, it's not new. We know some examples from EU as well as from the US. And always when we think about algorithms and cartels, I think it's beneficial to somehow structure your mind, and I think this is a beautiful way how to do it. That's the 4 non-exclusive categories of collusion, and I think that everybody here in this virtual room know about it. So basically, we can have this type of messenger, then hub and spoke, when basically all the undertakings use the same algorithm. Then we have the type of predictable agent, when they use a similar algorithm, but the algorithm is not really the same. And then we can have an autonomous machine, where the algorithms is basically so deep learning that it can collude by its own. So let's think about algorithms, pricing algorithms as a facilitation for the collusion. So imagine you as an undertaking would like to participate in a tendering procedure. So therefore you have to calculate the price, and how you will do it. Of course, you will employ some algorithm. At the very least, you will use Excel sheet, but there are some more, so much sophisticated. 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah, so much more sophisticated tools how to do that. So, for instance, since all the data or many that are available throughout the internet. You can harvest this data, you can compare the prices of your competitors, you can analyze their previous behavior, and plus you can employ a little bit of self-learning into the algorithm. And so basically, the calculation of the price is not really your doing, it's the doing of the algorithm. And this is something which could fall within the second or the third category with a little bit of addition given maybe from the fourth category. Okay, so would such usage or such employment of pricing algorithm be covered by 101? The first thing on the top of my head is, of course, the concerted practices. So let's discuss briefly them. So we all know that we do not have to reach the agreement when we are discussing concerted practices. What we need to have is basically some uniform behavior, higher concerted action, and some causality between these two. And there is no difference between agreement and concerted practices because both of them are prohibited. But where the difference really is the normal practice on the one hand and the concerted practice on the other. So how we distinguish whether employment of this algorithm will be prohibited or not? So normally, or in the previous cases when algorithms were not so much discussed, so this was proved basically by some objective evidence. So you would see how the undertakings were behaving on the market, and then you said, okay, this is totally unnatural. So basically, it looks like you are colluding because that's the only possible explanation. So you could somehow objectivize the mental consensus between the parties. However, if we use the algorithms, I'm not sure whether this is possible because it's the setting of the prices is not that much of your doing, it's the doing of the algorithms. And of course that you somehow develop the algorithm, but if there is a little bit of self-learning element in the algorithm, then it's not only your doing, it's also the doing of the algorithm itself. So here we have I think a little bit of problem of how to define the same behavior which might be concerted practice and the same behavior which might be a normal practice. And it seems that the intention of the undertaking would be the breakpoint. And this, I don't believe it's a great news for the enforcement, for the enforcers, so for competition authorities, because it's very difficult to prove the intention. And on the other hand, it's a little bit problematic from the perspective of the objective liability of which should be set by competition law, because then if the intention is the breaking point, then do we still talk about objective liability or not? Not really. Okay, so for the rest of my time, maybe I will save it for the discussion. And yeah, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you. David, your microphone.
Yes, sorry, thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. Oliver, you have a question.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I was wondering if the collusion is based on algorithms, and the algorithms are looking to do the best for their owners in a way. But then wouldn't that mean that although the collusive equilibrium, when they sort of charge cartel-like prices, even if there's no intent provable, that this is profitable for the group of the companies, but for each individual company, it should be even more beneficial and profitable to be a bit below that. So in other words, would it be actually logical to stick in the collusive level from the algorithms, or would the algorithms themselves not go into the same trap of instability that human organizers of cartels run?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that comment or question. Well, yeah, I was thinking about it, that actually, yeah, it would be best for the individual undertaking to deviate from this behavior. On the other hand, think about it that you you have a very few, let's say 3 or 4 participants because of the specificity of the market. Let's say it's about building a highway. Okay, so there are not many undertakings who can do that. And so basically what you can face is that, let's say that you would like to collude, and you do it through these algorithms, and then it's, if there is no evidence of agreement, and if there is no evidence of intention, how the competition authorities will know that this is really a collusion, if this can also be explained by, okay, it's just algorithms that are calculating the prices. Okay, so this is what I'm a little bit afraid of.
I fully agree that that the use to hide the cartel, which is actually human intention, is very interesting. Although it still remains, if we can show that it is more logical for the algorithms to deviate, then actually, and I'm not a law expert, I'm an economist, but then it can only be human intention behind it, or wouldn't that be enough?
Well, I think that, and anyone can correct me, but I think that the status quo now is that the competition authority have to prove that basically this is the only explanation. Then the undertaking can disprove it. Okay, but look, it can be also another explanation, and they will say, okay, the other explanation is that, look, we have these algorithms, and there's a little bit of self-learning in them, so we don't know really what they are doing. And then you are like, okay, there is this another explanation. It looks valuable. So then, I mean, what's then the hot potato is back in the competition authority, and then I don't know what they can say to prove this concerted practice.
I was thinking a bit like they did with the bundling cases, where they unbundled the technology and showed that there was no beneficial effects, so the competition authorities could run such an algorithmic system and show that it actually doesn't automatically lead to the collusive solution.
I don't know whether
I
now
understand. In the Microsoft case, at least that's what they say, that they actually, the reasoning was that the bundling of the Explorer and of the operating system was beneficial, and then they actually unbundled it and showed that there was no loss in it.
Yeah.
That's how the story was told to me. I'm not a law expert, yeah. And I was thinking a bit about the same. So if they say that the algorithm is doing it all by themselves, then of course the competition authority could run such an algorithmic system and could probably show that it, through time, there will be more non-collusive than collusive equilibria. That's at least what all algorithmic systems so far show. And that would then, would that be my question, would that be then enough to prove that there must have been an intention?
Well, I'm afraid that maybe not.
Okay, Maria, we are going to open the discussions to other members. Michal, would you raise it? You have a question on the, yeah, please.
Right. Hi, Maria. Thank you so much. This is, the future, even whether we like it or not. My question is, at least in the meantime, and until we get other tools, how far does the notion of facilitating practices some of your issues? Because, at least it's not only the algorithm itself, it's the data you feed it. Sometimes it's the kind of algorithm you use. I mean, there might be all kinds of decisions around the use of the algorithm that signal that this is exactly what you want. Okay, so for example, if I choose to use your own algorithm, or a very simple one that says whatever Maria does, do, set the same price, that by itself might be a signal.
Yeah.
Practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you, but what I was thinking about, that maybe what would be beneficial, and I don't know, we can discuss that, would be maybe to certify certain pricing algorithms. The certification of softwares, it's not a new idea. It's well employed in, for example, in with the games, with casinos and so on. So. And maybe, since we are talking about spending of public money, there could be some public interest in employing only certified pricing algorithms, and therefore we could maybe avoid all these problems? I know that was something what I was thinking about, but I don't know.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you. Excellent talk. Now we are going to hear Oliver on the economics of international competition policy, new challenges in the light of digitization. Oliver, you're a professor of economic theory and director of the Institute of Economics at Ilmenau University of Technology in Germany. So please, Oliver, the floor is yours now for 10 minutes. We can't hear you. Yeah, you have to unmute your microphone.
So now it finally. So thank you very much for having me, and sorry for the micro issue. The topic of international competition policy is not a very new one, not like algorithm and stuff like that. Actually, the question whether international or intercontinental competition require also some international competition policy is roughly 100 years old. And the current state of the debate, in a way, is that in the combination of the effects doctrine, meaning that every jurisdiction is caring about the cases that have an effect within their country, plus a cooperation among agencies through the International Competition Network, but also directly, is sort of providing a situation that is better than nothing, but also not optimal in the sense that there are problems which remain, but which do not seem to be so bad that they require immediate action. In particular, since such a situation may not be optimal from an economics perspective, maybe even not from a law perspective, but it seems to be the best available option from a political perspective, in the sense that no agreement on binding international rules or an international authority or whatever seems to be on the horizon. And that's also probably the reason why this question has not been discussed so intensively in the last 5 to 10 years. Throughout its history, it seems to come and go in waves. Yeah, so there's sometimes there's intense discussion, then it goes down again, and in the moment it's not discussed so a lot. However, with digitization, we have a new development that, as we have seen in this conference and many presentations, is really changing the game and the state of competition policy in many areas. And so my question here is, how does digitization of markets changes the picture in terms of international competition policy? Does it make more international competition policy in the sense of going further in the cooperation? Does it make this more or less urgent? And what I'm doing is that I'm taking 4 areas where the current system, effects doctrine plus ICN, interagency cooperation, is not sufficient. I've written about this lots and lots of time. Many will say too often. And I will take these areas, these 4 areas of where problems are, and have a look whether digitization is actually aggravating these problems or maybe alleviating these problems. And the first area of problems in economic terms would be cross-border externalities. Due to the inbound focus of competition policy, caring about what is happening within their jurisdiction, we often have negative external effects, sometimes also positive external effects on other jurisdictions. And of course, what digitization does, and this is actually true for the rest of the points that I'm going to discuss, what digitization does is, in terms of international competition policy, it makes first more markets international due to digital distribution and platforms and so on and so forth. And it makes markets more international in the sense that, especially if the good is digital itself, then we can have something that we actually didn't have in the old world, which would be truly global markets. Yeah? As long as we have physical goods, it's highly unlikely that the market is truly global, but with digital goods, that's actually possible. And yeah, due to these characteristics of the digital economy, and due to the characteristics like network effects, data-based business models, and so on, so that we really get international platforms dominating almost worldwide markets. This creates more externalities by itself, but it may also contribute to a revival of strategic competition policies favoring national champions, or as we in Europe nowadays are talking about European champions and stuff like that. Of course, this discussion, this debate is not fueled by digitization alone. We also have the policy movements, and they're probably even more important, yeah, Trumpism and stuff like that. But still, at least in Europe, and I can see that also in Latin America and in Asia in some countries, there is this idea that domestic competitors to the GAFA, US-based GAFA platforms and services need to be raised, and raising these domestic competitors, then it's often just a short step to the idea of creating a national European champion by biasing competition policy towards domestic companies or against foreign companies. So this is discussed more again, and so there is a certain danger that this is coming up again. And this development would mean that the problems coming from cross-border externalities are rather increasing due to digitization. The second area I would like to talk about are the costs and the burden of multiple procedures. So,
4 minutes left.
Yeah, that's perfect. Competition authorities increasingly address the same cases. Now, the Facebook case is addressed, I don't know by how many competition authorities, Google as well. And so the competition authorities around the world more and more deal with the same cases. And that, of course, includes also an increasing probability of diverging and conflicting decisions. Well, the US authorities will maybe come to a different conclusion in regard to Facebook than the European Commission or than the Japanese competition authority, or as we just had the Bundeskartellamt in Germany doing a Facebook decision for Germany, global market, global company, German decision. And of course, all these decisions, they will not fit to each other. And despite the impressive work of the ICN and the improvements in interagency cooperation, this means that these multiple procedures increase, and with the increase of multiple procedures, the costs for taxpayers increase. We have lots of authorities doing the same thing, trying to find out the same facts, not 100% the same facts, but roughly the same facts. And of course, there are high transaction costs for companies, which may be nice if the companies are doing wrong, but which is not nice if the companies, in some of the cases, of course, will be such when the companies are actually efficient, and then efficient business strategies will be layered with these transaction costs. So we have welfare losses here, and these problems become worse. It looks a bit different when we talk about loopholes in the protection of competition. And in the current regime, these loopholes especially fall on powerless regimes, where the internal market is not important enough to discipline multinational giants. And this is especially the regimes of poorer and smaller countries. The fact that we are discussing more and more the same cases has a positive effect here, which is some sort of an umbrella effect. When the big antitrust regimes in Europe and the US discipline Google, Facebook, whatever, then this may actually mean that their harmful practices will not take place in the smaller jurisdictions as well. It doesn't need to be like this in every case, but at least in some cases it will be. Very evidently, when we talk about mergers, if a big merger is blocked by the European Union or by the US, then it's also blocked for smaller countries. But there are also negative effects regarding the loopholes. We are facing, as competition authorities are facing bigger and more powerful global players. We are talking more about abuse of market power cases than we talk about mergers and cartels, actually, which means that it's really the fight with the giants that is important. And I think this is something which has been overlooked a lot, is that the availability and the costs of specialists that are experts in data and information-related issues, people you need when you want to discuss with Google and Facebook whether their algorithms are abusive or not, then you need people who understand the way these algorithms work and how they are analyzed and so on. And these specialists are very rare worldwide. And this also means that for competition authorities, it's very difficult to get their hands on them, and the poorer you are, the more difficult it gets. I'm almost done, yeah. So the effect on loopholes is probably mixed. Very quickly, last slide. The digitization, penultimate slide, the digitization process, as we have heard in this conference numerous times, affects goals, theories, and methods of competition policy. Yeah, we discussed the interface of competition, consumer protection. We have to discuss new business strategies, new consumption behavior, privacy data, stuff like that. And both the change of the market and the dynamics of research are ongoing. And now, final slide. This means that the competition authorities have to act before we have a settled ground. The cases are there, we cannot wait. And this means that, as we can observe in the moment, national competition policies will find different solutions for the problems they are facing. Yeah? For instance, Germany is in the moment discussing to introduce a completely new concept of abuse of market power, not single market power, not collective market power, but a concept named an outstanding relevance across markets to be market power which can be abused. Yeah? And these different solutions create a new divergence of competition policy regimes. And that, of course, can be positive and negative as well. It may allow for fruitful experimentation with innovative concepts like the ORAM in Germany, but externalities, conflicts, costs, and inconsistencies increase. And as such, I think there's some indication that we need to revive the call for better international rules. Thank you very much.
We have a lot of questions. Thank you very much, Oliver. We have a lot of questions for you. Eleanor, would you, are you with us? You have a question, Eleanor.
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Oliver. I think that's excellent and exactly right. I like your format of analysis. I wanted to add on when you were talking about loopholes in the poorer countries, that even with respect to big mergers, they seldom even get the umbrella effect of enjoining the huge merger that hurts them the most, like the big cement mergers and the big seed mergers. I wonder what you think is possible politically, because I think that just while we have a greater need for some higher level of even just coordination, that the political elements might be even stronger against it. And so and that ICN, for example, actually does not do cross-border problems, at least it hasn't, and because they involve trade and competition. So what do you think is possible in view of this lay of the land? Thanks.
That is the most difficult question that you could ask, Eleanor, because what is possible is largely determined by the political sphere, right? But I absolutely agree with you. I think that when we talk about mergers in digital markets, then we may have more of an umbrella effect as if we talk about mergers where the problem was not found or was not addressed by the big authorities because the effects actually took place abroad in the smaller countries. Yeah, then of course there's no umbrella effect, but with the GAFA and co-companies, there may be some umbrella effect. But I fully agree with you that we need to step beyond the ICN, or we need to have a new agenda for the ICN. I made in some of my papers a suggestion about finding systems where we remain on a cooperative level, but not every jurisdiction is doing everything by itself, but we have some kind of lead jurisdictions that lead a group of authorities analyzing a case for everyone, and also with the perspective of everyone. I don't think David will give me the time to detail that concept here, but but there are some papers where I've detailed that. But whether politicians like that,
Thank you, Oliver. Magali, you have 1 minute. You have a question on the conflicting decisions, but only 1 minute, and just a comment, please.
Sure. I think it's more than political, though. I think it's about the legitimacy of the laws, right? So different jurisdictions have different standards and different normative frames, and therefore laws are developed differently. Although I would love consistency internationally, I think it would be democratically and legally illegitimate.
Yes, absolutely. In the paper, I'm a bit more differentiated than I could be in the very brief talk, and there are also advantages of having multiple regimes. So I fully agree with your point, and that's also why I think that we don't need a monolithical international cartel office, where I also would be afraid that this would turn to be a very bureaucratic thing at the end of the day. Yeah, but more a cooperation, but not a cooperation where everyone works by itself and we talk about it, but maybe something where someone takes the lead here and someone takes the lead there, and everyone has a view on everyone's needs and purposes.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was really excellent, as always. Now we have Stefan. Stefan leans on supply-side substitutability in technological markets, what became of the metal stamper problem. And Stefan is a lecturer in law and director of international legal programs at the New College of the Humanities, the London campus of Northeastern University of Boston. Are you with us, Stefan?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, everyone. So
the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, get the slides up. And let's hope this all works. There we are. Can everyone see that? Well, if you can't. Okay, great. Perfect. So I have 10 minutes. I'm just going to start a timer to speak with you about the metal stamper problem. And you might ask, what is the metal stamper problem? We'll get to that, the definition. But the fundamental point is to look at supply-side substitutability in the context of entry, which are related concepts. Everyone in this audience, it's a sophisticated audience, will all know about the point that substitutability usually goes to product definition, whereas entry usually goes to constraint. That's always been a tension, and it's very hard to resolve because although you can think of differences between those concepts, it can be difficult to get them to align nicely. And I think it might be particularly difficult to do that in relation to online markets. And there's one point which came to me particularly in pulling the slides together off of the paper, and it's this. Do we jump as a community to an idea of high fixed costs and low variable costs when that isn't always true, and where the implications may be different if you were to relax some of those assumptions? But let me give you an overview before plowing on. And in particular, what I'd be really grateful for is any insights from other jurisdictions. Based in the UK, my presentation's a bit UK-centric. I have some American colleagues in Boston in the mothership for our university who've inputted, so there's a bit of US material. But I'd really appreciate any examples, particularly from merger reviews. If anyone knows them, maybe if you could put them in the chat, that would be really helpful. So the overview, first of all, what is the metal stamper problem? Second, why does it matter? And finally, this question about the tension with sector-specific approaches, which I think the thesis is, in a nutshell, that sector-specific regulators have done a better job at thinking clearly about supply-side substitutability versus entry. So first of all, what is the metal stamper problem? Well, as it says on the slide, we're going to have to go back in time together to a different period when there were metal hubcaps on cars, which is a long time ago. But with the way the economics developed on this, the canonical example was a machine stamping out, like on the left, a metal hubcap versus on the right, a metal hat. There's a fireman's hat. The 1982 US horizontal merger guidelines, which we'll come to in a bit, refer to the idea of easy technological switching and implied entry from that. So this idea of a metal hubcap, you just change the machinery around, you've got a hat, Does that mean they're in the same market? Possibly not, but it might be something to consider in the product definition stage. Let's think of some other examples. There's actually a very interesting one. If you go back and read Posner's original antitrust law book, he mentions that this is a property of the cellophane case, the famous DuPont case from the 1950s. He doesn't refer to cellophane specifically, he refers to an analogy. A folding carton produced for one soap company is not interchangeable with a folding carton produced for another. But the two products are made with the same components, facilities, equipment, workers, etc. He also refers to parts for cars of different brands. So if we think about cellophane, why exactly is it that that is not an example of imperfect interchangeability? Clearly, there is a judgment call that's exercised, but is it exercised with regard to demand or supply side factors? Is it that someone could enter from a related market, or is it that products are interchangeable from the consumer perspective? Well-known debate. More recent example is in Bishop and Walker Economics VC Competition Law 2010, red paint and green paint. Would you really want to model a market for red paint? Probably not. Green paint is just another type of paint. That's a level of specificity which simply isn't required. Very recently here in the UK, we had the rather sort of hunger-generating case. I thought I'd give you some slides to make us all hungry, sort of thing we might be eating in a breakout if this were happening in person. Snacks. Snack flavors. The Tato case. Now, I won't go off on a tangent because I don't have much time, but in a nutshell, Northern Ireland's great contribution to world cuisine was in fact the flavored crisp in the 1950s, and it was invented by the Tato Group company, which wanted to buy a pork snack company in 2018. We'll come back to that, but for now, let's just know, if you have a machine that can make a regular crisp and it can change into a crinkled one or different flavors, do we need to analyze this problem at a more granular level? Maybe not. Let's look at what the CMA did with that in a bit. I know I'm at the 5-minute point. This is, of course, different from entry. We've got the classic case on entry, which is the 1984 case from Dallas, that basically, as it says on the slide, it's easy to enter this market. In fact, rather scurrilously, we were reminded by the court that a person wanting to start in the trash collection business can acquire a truck, containers, and drive the truck and operate out of his home. A thoroughly unrealistic view of entry, but that would be entry, and it's different from the product demand. Why does this matter? Well, at the moment, as of yesterday, we have the consultation on the market definition notice, which is going to be updated, and it's a very deep question in a technology market, whether you look at this as a matter of product demand or entry, because entry will often pivot very easily. Otherwise, you might end up with a market definition which says something like market for red cars versus blue cars. You may be familiar with the Worden and Kaplow debate from about 10 years ago on that point. Why ever define a market? Well, let's look at how it's being done with a few practical examples. There are a number of possibilities. First is that consumer demand might change and a supplier might meet the change. A second possibility is that the supply might change in a constrained market and consumer demand would follow. Or you could imagine interchangeable effects between supply and demand. My contention would be that we're a little bit consumer focused and don't think much about supply. And this is better understood in sector specific applications. Let's look at how this has been captured in some sector specific applications. On the slide, there are some guidelines from the Hong Kong Telecoms Authority, which address the point directly. 3.43, confusion sometimes arises between supply-side substitution, on definition, and entry. How do they say to resolve it? Well, supply-side substitution is about switching production lines, whereas market entry is about sunk costs. How has this been captured in more general guidelines? Let's look at the US, the EU, and the UK for some quick-fire examples. The 82 guidelines in the US refer to productive and distributive facilities. The 92-97 commentary refers to supply substitutability and entry together as concerned with future market participants. Finally, the 2010 guidelines say rapid entrance, a much narrower concept, and put the emphasis back onto demand. The EU is a bit more complicated. Continental CAN itself refers to production characteristics, so clearly a supply side specification is present. The 97 notice refers to the relevance of substitutability, doesn't rule it out. And a little known, now somewhat less prominent report from 2001 actually notes the potential for very large effects from supply side substitutability. In the UK, we have the approach which is somewhere between the US and the EU. The boundaries of the product market are generally determined by demand side sub, but there may be situations where supplier response broadens the market, so it's not just an entry matter. I promised you 3 sector-specific applications. I'm conscious of time. The one I'd really want to go big on is the AT&T non-dominance petition. This is quite old now, but it may be interesting for the future. So in the 90s, AT&T argued that it was no longer dominant, and interestingly, the FCC agreed. It said one should look at capacity constraints and think about these in determining the product market, not only entry. Another example from the UK is BTEE. The CMA looked at the market in terms of mobile backhaul, but Ofcom put in wholesale network access as well. The sector-specific regulator did that on the basis of supply-side constraints, whereas the authority would not. So what we have, and I'm conscious of time, is a bit of a departure between sector-specific approaches and general approaches, which might be merited, of course. There's also an example from France, which I don't know that we'll have time for, but very similar, technological market definition in Wanadu versus a demand-only one at the EU level. So just to conclude, I want to refer to 2 cases, which I'm quite familiar with from the UK, and this is where other examples will be really helpful. In the Tato case itself, we're reminded that demand and supply side switching is possible. But 1 year later, the same authority looking at an online market put forward a definition in a discounting market for a cashback-based discount. What does that mean? Well, it means that a particular species of advertising becomes a market definition, even though there was plenty of evidence in the case that supply-side switching was highly possible. You're talking about, flicking a switch on a website to move from this particular presentation of a discount to a different one. So which is right? They can't both be correct. Either you can switch the flavors like in Tato, or you can switch the presentation like in TCB. So the questions to conclude, and I'm conscious of time, is whether the demand sides become overly dominant and whether this has drawn attention onto some small markets. So maybe looking at spare capacity is something which is being slightly neglected. But I'd be very interested in the thoughts of the group, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're opening the discussion. Thibault, would you, I think you have a question on the chat.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Yes. All right. Perfect. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the presentation and all of those examples. My question was regarding when you mentioned the substitutability of products, and I was wondering if you would agree with a proposal that would argue for taking into consideration non-substitute products in the market definition.
So a proposal, could you just run that past me again? So it just cut out.
Yes, sure. So the European Commission has been, taking substitute products into consideration, and then has been pretty vocal in saying we should also take into consideration potential competition. And it seems, at least in my opinion, potentially a way to do that would be not only to consider substitute products, but also non-substitutable products, because they could actually exercise pressure over one another. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that idea?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And it really is the hard one, because as soon as you define the market, I mean, that cashback case is a really interesting one to look at for this reason. In that case, according to the decision in phase 1, it was possible in theory for people in related markets, which were not direct substitutes for a user needing that particular presentation, to enter. But the authority took the position that because that hadn't happened as a matter of fact, it couldn't be a piece of evidence. Now, I think that's exactly the case that you mentioned, and I do think it's problematic. In that, let's think about some of these markets. The AT&T case is a good paradigm example. if you take that approach in AT&T, you would probably look at the lack of substitutability at that point in time rather than the more dynamic effects. So I think it's a way of getting dynamic effects in where they're merited. One thing that does come out of that, though, just briefly, is it isn't all one way. It could run the other way. And I'd refer to the mobile merger, VTEE, as an example of that, many more in the paper, because sometimes it may be that you have a supply constraint. So this could easily look like just a kind of liberalizing agenda, but it can actually be sometimes a stronger specification of a market with fewer substitutes. It would all just depend on what the supply constraint is. The meta question, I guess, is whether we're doing it properly.
Thank you, Stefan. Stefan, you have also very interesting questions to answer on the chat. So pay attention to it.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you very much. We're going to ask to the last panelist to take the floor. So Victoria, are you here?
Yeah, I'm
Victoria, here. You're a PhD candidate at Utrecht University, I guess with Thibault. And your paper is entitled Commercial Hyper-Nudging in the Digital Market Economy. Should we worry about consumer choice? Is that it? Are you ready?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, the floor is yours. And I suggest you switch off your camera because the connection is not that good.
Okay, let me try to do that.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. You have 10 minutes. Thanks.
Let me try to switch off the video. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, so far, yes, we do.
Okay, that's great. So thank you very much for having me. This is my very first ASCOLA, and I'm very, very excited to share what I have been working over the past year. So at this stage, I also very much welcome any ideas or comments. The main subject of my research are novel hyper-nudging techniques, and I'm going to kind of walk you through what I mean by that. I will also take the example of consumer steering and then look into how do hyper-nudges, if at all, affect consumer choice. And finally, maybe most interesting for the audience here is what would be the role for European competition law, and if any. So before we go into hyper-nudges, of course, we first must discuss its humble predecessor. And Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein developed the nudge theory in the governmental context and relied on the premise that people's decision-making is constrained by the environmental and cognitive limitations. And they defined a nudge as any aspect of online choice architecture, that does not prohibit any options and do not significantly change any economic incentives. So to limit the scope of such practices, the requirement of intentionality was also introduced. So when we think about nudges, we also think about something like default pension schemes or some sort of social cues or heuristics used usually by government. So when we move into hyper nudges, this is a very specific to the online phenomenon. And we talk about big data powered nudges that provide users with highly personalized online choice environments. So in addition to the features of offline nudges, we know that hyper nudges are dynamically personalized. And what that means is that they can adjust in real time and they deliver these kind of recommendations to users which are very much tailored to them. They are also predictive and they are often covert. And I say often because it's not a strict requirement, but at the same time, users experience hyper nudging as covert. They do not usually feel that they are being steered. So the bottom line here is that hypernudges do not prohibit any options. This means that they fall short of coercion, actual coercion, and they do not impose physical constraints upon individuals who have very strong contrary preferences to choose otherwise. On the other hand, the choice architect does exercise perception control and what does the user see. So it does impose cognitive constraints upon decision making that may potentially hinder exercise of free choice. So I think here actually I would be very curious also to hear from you if anyone has any experience or any literature in terms of what, if you think about such strategies, what would be the, their effects on consumer preference forming, for instance. So here is an example of consumer steering because it does tick a lot of boxes. And you can think about online marketplaces such as Amazon. Here you can also consider that this could be a hypernudge, especially if it allows the platform to predict consumers' predispositions, moods, or personality traits. So consumer steering refers to a business practice that personalizes consumer search queries based on their data, meaning that for a different search query, different businesses would be shown, different buyers would be shown different results. And we have an example of Amazon Marketplace, which is quite interesting because so far so good. The users would be given a very relevant and personalized options for their search queries, but we see that there are growing concerns that these platforms do actually, that they are led by their economic imperatives. So for instance, Amazon's algorithm was updated in 2019 to do just that, to provide the most profitable items instead of best-selling listings or something that's most relevant. Sorry, I'm running out of breath because it's short time. So naturally, when I was thinking about hypernudges, I was immediately thinking about what does it have to do with consumer choice? Because we can think of such strategies as something that could necessarily infringe upon that. And when we think about consumer choice, the interesting question, of course, is what is the desired level of consumer choice? And we know actually that despite this kind of assumption that the more choice, the better, we know that adding alternatives to the option set actually does not increase the meaningful choice for the consumer because of the cognitive cost involved in decision making. So some forms of nudging and filtering are actually quite necessary because it would be relevant for the user to see only what they prefer to see, right? And that is so far so good.
4 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. And we know that the characteristics of hypernudging also show that the platforms do have the data to actually pinpoint what would that individual prefer, maybe. So we could see some win-win situations where there would be the interest of the choice architect, which is the platform, fulfilled, as well as the consumer would receive exactly what they're looking for. However, at the same time, of course, there is a tricky part. We know that characteristics of hypernudges create possibilities for abuses that are very difficult to spot. And these kind of abuses can go on for very long periods of time. And at the very core of the problem lies the question, whose interest would be guiding the hypernudge? And here in the market context, it is very difficult to see a situation where private, profit-driven platforms' goals would not be trumping what is best for the consumer, right? So unless the two interests concur, it is unlikely that such hypernudges would serve a legitimate purpose, creating concerns about market manipulation and also potential consumer harm. In other words, a dominant, for instance, a dominant or vertically integrated platform could engineer self-preferencing treatment within its algorithms that could go unnoticed. And as such, hypernudging is not experienced as coercion or forceful leading, these platforms may maintain this facade of offering an abundance of options to its users, while at the same time increasing friction and actually limiting the meaningful choice through manipulative market behavior. So of course, I'm coming back here to the same big question, which remains unanswered: to what extent do indeed such hyper-nudging have consumer preference forming effects? That's very interesting. So quite briefly, is there a role for European competition law? And we know that competition policy is not concerned with protecting the individual decision-making per se. It is concerned with protecting the overall material welfare of the society. However, in situations where gatekeeping platforms use hyper-nudging in a large-scale and systemic manner, the negative effects on the competitive process may materialize too. And here we can look also at that temporal dimension. And over time, when these practices go unnoticed, it may lead to kind of foreclosure of competitors. And for what it's worth, of course, the Google shopping decision did show that design choices matter. So it can be quite naturally expected that in cases where consumers are steered in a highly personalized and dynamic manner, the platform can be likely to obtain unjustified advantage that would fall outside the scope of competition on merit. Now, I'm not going to pretend that these limits are very clear for us, what competition on merits are, and I would very much encourage any comments on this. So, to conclude, the bottom line is that systemically limiting consumers' choice in the short term through hyper-nudging may lead to uncompetitively reduced consumer choice in the long term. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's the end of the presentation. Oh, I can't hear.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you very much. Nicolo, you have a question on the chat. Would you ask the question out loud, or do you want?
Yes,
I don't know.
I can repeat it. So, thank you very much, Victoria. Very interesting paper and research. I am myself struggling with this question, as you probably know, of trying to limit the concept of nudging, because we have a lot of rules in antitrust that rely on incentives. And here, in the definition that you use as a basis for the work, you use Sunstein's and Taylor's definition, which says that basically a nudge is anything that alters people's behavior in a predictable ways without forbidding choices and without significantly altering their economic incentives. So that leaves out a whole range of situations that we usually can deal with under the normal tests, the traditional tests that we use in antitrust. So the question is, would this concept of nudging cover other things that do not fall there, and what constitutes a significant change of the economic incentives? I guess that's a big question. I'm not expecting a full-fledged answer at this point.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for such a great question. I mean, of course, Sunstein's and Thaler's definition was very, very wide in the beginning, and that's why they introduced the element of intentionality as well. So there is that element of intention, and of course, I know in competition law we don't really necessarily look at the intention of the companies, but that is indeed a requirement. What does constitute a significant economic kind of incentive? That's indeed a good question. In my paper, I kind of alluded to the idea that it must be maybe the main motivation for the consumer to purchase that good, if that constitutes the main motivation. But then again, I do understand that there are limitations to this answer as well. So I share very same issues, I guess, as you.
Thank you. Oliver, you have a question, but I hope it's a very short question, please.
Okay, I try. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I think there are two different things here. One is consumer behavior, and one is competition, economics, policy, law, and a bit also like Ruprecht writes in the chat, and I think Nicolo also pointed a bit to. Is there anything more competition law relevant here than self-preferencing? So the incentives for the ones who design the algorithms to favor some cross-market integrated whatever. Because if there's nothing beyond that, then I think industrial economics, competition economics have shown instruments to deal with that, and the jump into this very difficult nudging theory is actually maybe not necessary.
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. Self-preferencing kind of came as a natural, looking at the kind of problem there is. And I think I would need to think a bit more. That's a very great question. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria, for this excellent presentation. And once again, I would like to thank all the panelists of this excellent panel. It was very inspiring. And yes, Ruprecht is applauding. Thank you very much. Now we are going to move on the other event of this late afternoon with a presentation of a new book, Victoria Robertson's new book entitled Competition Laws, Innovation Factor, the Relevant Market in Dynamic Contexts in the EU and the US. Victoria, you are Associate Professor of Law at the University of Graz, where you teach EU competition law, comparative competition law, and commercial law. And from September, you will hold the chair in commercial law and digitalization at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Victoria, are you here?
Yes, I am.
So we are so glad to hear about your book. You will have only 10 minutes to present your book. That's not a lot, of course, because it's a very important topic here in Europe, but also in the United States and in other parts of the world. And it's going to be really interesting to have a discussion of your book with Sandra Marco Colino. Sandra, you are here. It's very late. I guess you are in Hong Kong now. You are Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and you are Deputy Director of the Center for Financial Regulation and Economic Development. Thank you very much, because it's very late in Hong Kong to be with us. And we will also have a discussion with Daniel Sokol. Daniel, are you here? I'm not sure. Daniel, you're Professor of Law at the University of Florida at the Levin College of Law. So we're going to start with Vicky. You're going to present your book, your new book, in only 10 minutes. And after that, Sandra and Danny will comment on your book in 10 minutes. And after that, we'll have a discussion with all the members, right?
Great. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Can you see my slides? David, my slides are up?
Yep.
Yep, great. So, thank you, David, for hosting this book launch, and I'm really pleased to be here to talk about, as David said, my new book by Hart Publishing Oxford, and thank you also to Danny and to Sandra for joining us in this very last session of this online Ascola conference. So what I'll try to do in the 10 minutes that I have is to present some of the aspects of my book, and the rest you can read for yourself. And what I thought would be most interesting in the context of this conference, of course, is how we can define relevant markets in our digital times. And the book also covers intellectual property rights. So what I'll start with is a very brief look at our current framework for market definition. So Ruprecht actually wrote not long ago that market definition translates an economic reality into the realm of the law. And why do we do this? We do this because the relevant market has two very important functions in competition law, or in antitrust, as they say in the US. First of all, it's a tool for market power assessments. So especially in the EU, we like to rely on market share thresholds to give us an idea of market power or the absence of market power under Article 101. But also in the US, and under the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, you would look at the relevant market to get an idea of the market structure and of market power that you can try and get from that. But the second function, I think, is equally important, and I think it's gaining importance, and that's the function of market characterization. So all those aspects of market definition that allow us to understand the market and to understand the theory of harm that we rely on in competition law. Now, I know I don't have to go into this in detail at this conference, so let me just say comparatively, the frameworks for market definition in the EU and the US are rather similar in the sense that in both jurisdictions, we have courts that are very vocal about the importance of market definition, and repeatedly so. So we've got the US Supreme Court telling us market definition generally determines the result of any case. And again, 2 years ago in Ohio American Express, it said the definition of the relevant market is of essential significance, and it determined the case more or less. And we also have in both jurisdictions competition authorities that give us guidance on how they apply market definition. In the US, it's primarily on mergers, but in the EU, we have the market definition notice that applies to Articles 101, 102, and mergers. And again, for the EU, the court also said, both the Court of Justice and the General Court, how important market definition was to competition law cases. So let's move on to digital markets. We've discussed the characteristics of digital markets at length during this conference, so I won't go into that. But I do want to point out that I kind of categorize them into 3 dimensions. That's the digital market and its characteristics, the characteristics of digital products, and I think that's very important for us, the dynamics of competition in digital markets, and especially our focus on multi-sided markets, so platforms, and also network effects. So as Stephen already pointed out, we have a consultation ongoing on the revision of the European market definition notice. And Margaret Vestager, who was yesterday's keynote speaker, she actually said in December of last year that this overhaul, this review was necessary because of digital markets and what they do to the economy and to just how business works. So we might need to adapt this important tool to the digital sphere. And I want to contribute to that debate with my new book on market definition. But my book is not limited to the EU, of course, and that's very much in line with what Oliver just said a few minutes ago on the importance of having some cross-jurisdictional, perhaps convergence in some aspects of competition law, because we have more and more international players, global players, companies that act across borders naturally by the way their business works. And for them, it's increasingly important to know they can rely on an antitrust law framework that is at least similar in many parts of the world, especially in big jurisdictions like the US and the EU, but also in others. So here for those companies, it can be and will be beneficial if we adopt a comparative approach and find some converging approach to market definition in dynamic market settings. So what are the challenges ahead for updating market definition so that it can adequately take into account the many dimensions of digital markets? So first of all, we need to ask, what is the product in digital markets? And this can often be difficult to gauge. Also, are zero price markets actual markets? I think now we've got some consensus that they are, but there's still a little debate going on that. Also, how can we take into account a market's multi-sidedness? And here we have seen diverging approaches in jurisdictions. Also, what's the role of ecosystems in market definition? And we've talked about those quite a lot during this Escola conference, and the importance of ecosystems and how we can take this into account. Also, how should we deal with fast-moving markets that are prone to overthrowing old market definitions? And very important, how do we delineate integrated markets that are interoperable, where we have developing functionalities and so on? And finally, also, are online and offline markets part of the same relevant market? So what I do in my book is that I look at every single one of these issues and several more in detail from a comparative EU-US perspective. And building on that, I propose two angles how to approach each of those issues. Once from the perspective of market power assessments, so the first function of market definition that I highlight, and once from the perspective of market characterization, so the second function that I find in market definition. Just briefly, in the few minutes that remain for my talk, if we look at the product dimension, we can see that it's very hard to just do the first step in market definition, that is to locate what the product might be that we're dealing with. If you think of digital platforms that are monetizing user data, the question is, are we looking at user data, at attention markets? Is it the advertising where the money is made that we should look at? Or also in freemium models where we have a monetized data model, but also a paid for service that the consumer can choose. Is that the same market or not? Digital assistants raise lots of questions. But let's move on to the IoT, so the Internet of Things. Different issues again, but related to the digital assistants as well. Namely, when we have this combination and this integration of hardware, software, data analytics, algorithms, and services, how can we find the relevant market or markets that we're dealing with? So just skipping some slides here. The question we should ask ourselves is, how can the relevant market remain a useful tool in digital markets? It's a very complex market environment, and that makes it difficult to establish clear market boundaries that we in competition law traditionally want to see. So that might have to change. And change is already underway in the sense that, for instance, the General Court in Cisco Systems has acknowledged that high market shares do not relate to market power necessarily in very dynamic markets. So that also has some implications for market definition. The second function of market definition, however, I think is getting more important than ever in the digital context, because we need to understand the market, who competes with whom, and what dynamics of competition there are, because only then can we actually also understand theories of harm. Now, that of course especially applies in multi-sided markets. And as I said, here we have seen instances of divergence in how courts actually define markets in multi-sided platforms. Those were not digital cases, it was both banking cards, but the idea is the same. So from a pragmatic perspective, how can we use market definition in those multi-sided platforms? It might just be that while market definition remains important, it will not be able to fulfill the same functions simply because we cannot draw any strong inferences from that kind of exercise. So with that, the question I think will be, can the functions of the relevant markets stay the same in digital markets? I suggest the answer is no. We might need to change our approach to market definition. And we might also need to change how we rely on this tool. I do, however, think that it can be a useful tool, especially when we're talking about market characterization, because then the market provides an important background to our theory of harm and a narrative for the case. So after this brief insight into my book, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I read the book, but I assume that everybody wants to get it now. Now we have 10 minutes for a discussion or comments from Sandra and Daniel, starting with Sandra. So Sandra, we have 10 minutes to you can comment on the book, or you can have discussions and ask questions to Vicky. It's up to you.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much. I've got the book here. I've read it and I very much enjoyed it. So I was very happy to be asked to comment on it. I will be brief because it's quite late here. So I hope I'm still coherent. But basically what I took from this book is that innovation is a topic on which is so difficult to be innovative. We're always talking about it at events like the conference that is about to conclude. And I think that Vicky managed to touch upon perhaps a less explored area, which is that of market definition in cases where there is an innovation angle. And I think this in itself is so brave. We all know just how intricate market definition is at the best of times. So it's no coincidence that we talk about everything else, but the market definition implications are frequently avoided. So if it's complex enough in other cases, then the question of how to take the dynamism of innovation into account in what is a somewhat static assessment can really be mind-boggling. So this is why I found the book to be such a valuable contribution, a very brave contribution as well. So I find the issue of unpredictability with innovation is crucial. So how do we get the crystal ball and look into the future to guess how innovation might or should impact market definition? Vicky explores 4 main areas, or 4 ways of taking innovation into account. If I remember correctly, it was innovative product markets, future markets, potential competition, and innovation markets. And we know that these have come up frequently in a lot of the case law, recent cases, etc. So the book takes us on a very thorough journey, which also considers specific issues of different kinds of innovative markets, including platform markets, which I think is one of the main strengths of the book. What I take from the analysis, which is emphasized almost throughout, is that market shares, in fact, may not be as reliable as an indicator for innovative markets as they are made out to be. You clearly prefer a more dynamic approach to market definition, as you have explained yourself just now in your presentation, which focuses on market characterization rather than market power. But each country, in your view, at the end of the day, if I understood that correctly, should decide which approach is best for their contextual needs. So perhaps the only issue I would say here, well, I wonder whether that choice would create excessive divergence between the regimes, particularly in the context of multi-jurisdictional investigations, merger assessments, and all of this, of course, is bound to happen in digital markets. I think you highlight the importance of convergence in your conclusions, in fact. I also think the book encourages a discussion as to whether what you refer to as market characterization can simply replace market power analysis or rather complement it. So I think that would be an interesting angle to take. Another important factor or aspect of the book for me is that while you are critical of the current approach to market definition, you also attempt somehow to rescue this tool. You don't altogether think it should be discarded. I feel that you intend to transform it into something that could be adequately suited to digital markets and to take into account innovation. You say at one point, and I quote, market definition may need to be reconceptualized along the lines shown in the study in order to make it a more useful tool in innovative markets. And this conclusion comes as others are proposing abandoning it altogether, as you probably know. So in this sense, it enriches the discussion as to the value of market definition beyond innovation as well. I just want to finish by saying that the book could not be timelier, of course. We've talked about the European Commission's review of its notice on the definition of the relevant market and Vestager's comments in this respect. I predict that it will become a fundamental reference for the research conducted on digital markets, which we know is vast at the moment. And it really has the potential to inform policy decisions in a not too distant future, since so much is now having to be discussed and decided. For us who teach in this field, the meticulousness of the research gives also immense didactic value to the book, I found. I don't think that you leave a single decision or case or soft law instrument untouched. You really have scrutinized everything. And it's also very, very well written. So I just want to congratulate you on this outstanding achievement and really thank you for the opportunity to comment on it. And maybe at the end, if we have time to discuss on some of these issues, then I would be happy to talk further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Would you like to comment on the comment, Vicky?
Sure, thank you. So thank you for that review, Sandra. So I think, yeah, as you said, market shares, I come to the conclusion that they're no good indicator of market power. And of course, I'm not the first and I won't be the last to say that. But I think it's especially important for us in Europe because there's so many instruments that we have and so also judgments. I mean, if you think of the AXO presumption at the 50% market share for dominance, if you think of the guidance by the Commission, but also of the binding block exemption regulations, so much is based on market shares at the moment, presuming that that indicates an absence or the presence of dominance, so of market power. If we agree that this is not a good indicator, so much will have to change. So I think it's not an easy step to take. It's the first step, but then we'll have to change a lot actually. So that's what I found quite daunting, but perhaps necessary. And on what you said on market power as a function, market characterization. So yeah, I do think that market characterization complements market power assessments. And in some respects, it might have to replace some of our old tools. But the question really is where we get legal certainty from then. And as you said, I don't think we should abandon market definition just yet, but we should definitely change our approach. So thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. One very interesting thing in your book is a comparison with the US and the EU system. So it might be very interesting to have the comments of Daniel. Daniel, are you here?
Yes. So
yes, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on the book. I can't show you my copy because I looked at it digitally, which maybe is a nice way of talking about digital markets. But actually, before I talk about the book as such, I want to talk about the book project because yesterday, Michal, who I see, and I and Giorgio Monti were on a panel for junior professors and PhD students of how to think about moving your career forward. And we focused on articles, and it's just we ran out of time. We didn't really get a chance to talk much about books. And I want to maybe link that discussion yesterday to, I think, what you do well here. To actually have a successful book, you have to say something new. And it's actually much harder than it sounds, right? To really come up with something novel, you either have to identify something that people really haven't thought about before. I think that was Michal's book on competition law in small economies. In your case, merger law, you'd say, I think there's a lot of work on that. You know, what's worthy of a book? And I think what you were able to do, and beyond just mergers, but on market definition, I'm going to focus on mergers in just a second. What you did with market definition was to really formulate something new and interesting. So part of what you did was the comparative aspect, but that was second order. Really, it was reconceptualizing how to take a field where the law doesn't quite make sense and comport with reality and move it in a new direction and show its applicability to multiple jurisdictions. And I think that's what a well-executed book idea has. And frankly, I think in terms of the exposition and in terms of the analysis, that you really pulled off something special here. So for the junior faculty who are listening in today, you know, don't just read the book because it's good. It is good, but read it because I think it's a nice model for how to think about taking an idea that's already complex and in a crowded space and really saying something novel. And since we're talking about novelty and we're talking about digital issues, I actually want to say, when I thought about the US discussion, which overall was good, and I think this also exists in Europe, so what would I have done differently? What would I have you think about? I'd say, in a sense, we have two different kind of market definition discussions. One in front of the agencies, in which the economists play a more central role, and then one in front of the courts, where the lawyers play a much more important role. And these are not equal roles in either setting as to how we define markets. And so I actually want to go to a case that came out after your book, to just show how that looks. And that case is one where you actually have, in a digital market, divergence between the US and the CMA, specifically the Department of Justice and the CMA, with regards to Saber's acquisition of Fair Logic. And, it's a case where they discussed how platforms work, but it's also a case where, frankly, DOJ, in challenging the case, had an oversimplified product market that didn't quite work. And even when when the expert for DOJ was sort of pushed on it, it didn't go so well. And I think that's sort of emblematic of broader issues of how we define markets. So why do I say that? When we get to the point of generalist judges and get out of the agencies, we get a different kind of issue. So we have sort of how we think about markets within our world, and then how we think about it outside our world to people who only occasionally play in our world. And what we ultimately need to have is a simplified way of framing issues so that generalist judges can understand. So essentially, we have a second kind of market definition problem. It's a different market in terms of who's analyzing. And where I would push you in your book is to think, does your reframing work both within agency discussions and then also to generalized courts? Is this something that is administrable? I don't actually have an answer for you on that, but it's the kind of thing that I think you need to think about and sort of work through. And certainly the book has aspects of that, but you didn't quite frame it in that way. And the reason why I think that matters is because at one of your chapters, you have this wonderful quote which says, market definition is basically what decides cases. And I think 95% of the time that's absolutely right, which is exactly why I think the book is so important. And if in fact you think that the framing has applicability in courts as opposed to in agencies, what I would suggest that you do is not leave this idea just to the book, but to extend it further in maybe an article or two of how does it get operationalized. How do you take some of the recent cases that we're now seeing where definition of market matters? And we can imagine the same thing would hold with the European case, Apple and Spotify, right? In terms of what is the market. I mean, we have any number of digital cases where I think market definition is going to be highly contested. What I'd like to see is you to take this model and see what cases come out differently of the cases that are truly digital market platform cases. Platform in quotes, because sometimes it's not the platform, but as you know, say with IoT, it's the platform ecosystem. And the reason I want you to do this is because early in the book, you discuss Dick Markowitz's work in the late 70s in questioning whether market definition was really appropriate. It was something that was really lost, and even though Kaplow had a paper in the early 80s. He basically left the field for some 20 years and then came back to it with a much more explosive paper. But actually marketing a paper on market definition is really important. The reason why people forgot about this idea is because the writing of Dick is simply totally impenetrable. He makes up not just words, but he makes up acronyms for words that only he understands the acronyms for. And Vicky, I know that you read the work, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. So for the rest of you, reading the Dick Markovits articles is like reading some of the really complex German philosophers of the late 19th century who wrote in complexity simply for the sake of writing in complexity. And so I think what you have here works potentially, but it only works if you continue to market the idea. So who has done this best? Steve Salop. It took him 3 years of presenting the Raising Rivals Cost initial paper that was in the American Economic Review before the paper finally came out, and basically has spent the next 25 years, every opportunity he can, simply raising the Raising Rivals Cost idea. You have something really fascinating here, but it's only going to work if you continue with it. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Vicky?
Great. So thank you, Danny, for those comments that are very well received, and notes have been taken. On your first point, economics and the law, so I think that's a really important point that you raised there. And actually in my book, I attempt to take a really legal approach to the question of market definition while still, as a lawyer, looking at a lot of economics and economic literature, but really trying to say judges and lawyers, practitioners, as well as academics in competition law, we need to understand market definition, what it does, and how it can be done to actually move forward in competition law. And I think in many jurisdictions, including Austria, the field is often left to economists. So with judges just saying, okay, the economists will decide that question. When in quite a few instances, actually, it's also a question of the law. So that's on your point of economics and the law. The second point, keep marketing this idea. So noted, and I'll do that. But yeah, I agree that it's important to actually then operationalize those ideas. So in the book, I proposed 2 sets of frameworks, how we could move forward. But of course, at some point, each jurisdiction will have to decide their own. And as Sandra said, that might then lead to some divergence.
Thank you, Vicky. So it's time now to open the discussion to the other members online. Do we have a question or a comment on the book? Please raise your hand. Yes. Paul Johnson is saying yes. Oh yeah, Roberto. Roberto, you have a question or a comment?
Congratulations for your book. I have a question about conglomerated acquisitions, mostly for the GAFAM. How to define this market? Because we can lose a case if you define very widely. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you, Roberto. So that touches exactly on my point of market power versus market characterization. Because if we use the market definition in a conglomerate merger, we'll possibly get separate markets. And to actually understand the relation between those, we'll need to analyze that carefully. And that might lead to the conclusion, as you said, that some mergers are not problematic at all. When we focus on market characterization, we'll take any links between companies or expansions into adjacent or maybe further away markets into account much sooner. So hopefully that could help.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Michal, do you have a question?
I do. I'm very, very much looking forward to reading it. I'm sure it's wonderful. I'm actually going. My question is a macro one, because it, from what you presented, it seemed like market definitions in the digital world are, even more difficult than even I thought they are. Okay, so. So the question is, going back to Commissioner Vestager's talk yesterday, would not all these limitations lead maybe to fuzzier regulation that is not competition law? Because they would say, well, competition law, it doesn't work. We don't even know how to define the market. And so let's go for regulation. Do a list of do's and don'ts and.
Thank you. So an excellent comment and question. I think that there is a risk that if we don't manage this well, that could be the case. And so I think it's especially important that the Commissioner and the DG Comp are now looking into how to really adapt the market definition notice to this new digital era. That was also the first recommendation that the German Competition Commission 4.0 made, was to review market definition because it's the basis for so much of our antitrust law. And I think you can also see that difficulty in market definition somehow in our discussions over the past 3 days of how do we define gatekeepers, how do we define ecosystems? It's all related to each other. So I think we'll have to think carefully about how we change the tools and how we apply the tools. And there's no easy answers.
We have a question from Stefan. Stefan.
Hi, yes, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation, very interesting, and clearly a very current question, very difficult one with the consultation out. I wanted to ask something specifically, which I'm sure will be addressed in great depth in your book, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, unfortunately. There's this debate, isn't there, about whether the market definition should follow consumer demand alone, or whether you put the supply side stuff in, which was the presentation which I was making earlier. And it strikes me from that research that the EU and the US do have somewhat different approaches. I agree with your position that they are similar in most material regards. But there is this slight difference that you are supposed to go, if you were before a court in the US, to Danny's point, you're supposed to look at the consumer demand first and then move on to any supply side considerations, whereas the Europeans have always been happier to treat that more interchangeably. I just wondered if you had a comment on whether one or the other is a stronger approach, or perhaps it's not a material difference at all.
Thank you for that question, also for your presentation earlier. So the way I see it and the way I researched it, courts on both sides of the Atlantic have told us supply side substitution should be taken into account, and authorities and agencies on both sides of the Atlantic increasingly neglect that. So I do think that when it gets to the courts, perhaps we might see a stronger focus on supply side substitution. And as you pointed out, it's a very important factor because it can completely change our view of the market. So I think that also, as you stressed in the digital sphere, that should be more of a focus.
Thank you.
Okay, we had a question from Ruprecht, but I assume that Ruprecht is not online anymore. So,
but I would skip my.
Sorry.
I would skip my question for Nicolo's question instead, or postpone it regarding the time.
Okay. So, Nicolo, do you have a question to ask?
Right. Yes. Thank you, Ruprecht. I just wonder. So it's very interesting. Congratulations, Vicky, also for the book. I wonder if in your notion of potential competition, you would include only the potential competition perceived from the firm's perspective of shifting their capacity to another market, or you would also include the role of financial investors that can, often they actually see the evolution of the markets and the industry sooner than anyone else. So maybe is there a role for asking financial investors what's their view on those markets and take that into account for competition authorities.
Thank you, Nicola. So I didn't consider it specifically in the book, but I do think that any information, so basically data, you can get on those markets will be helpful for understanding them and for seeing where the market might be heading. But as Sandra said before, it's so hard to actually gaze into that crystal ball. So any information should be used. The question is then, how much do you rely on that? And of course, how credible is it?
Okay, thank you. Do we have one last short question? Maybe Rupert? That's
okay, I can. I can. Maybe not short one. First, I make a mental note how good these book launches are. I really like that idea. Thank you, Michal, or whoever came up with that. I really enjoyed that. Secondly, Vicky, something you alluded to in your talks, and obviously, congrats first of all to the book. If market definition is so difficult and complex in each of these cases, don't we have to think about the step how important market definition is? I mean, I'm not against abolishing market definition, but maybe sort of I sometimes have the impression, and you know that, and I guess you have something to say on that, that the problem is that regulators are sort of captured once they have defined the market and think this is a sharp sort of concept, while we know, and you've pointed to that so exactly, that we do not have these exact figures and these exact market definitions. So do we have to consider what happens on the next steps, or have you given any thought on that?
Thank you so much for that. So yes, market definition is complex, and it's getting even more complex, I think, in the digital platform markets especially. But as I said, I do see a role for it, but that might be a changing role. And what we do have to consider is if we agree to change that role, then we also have a lot of knock-on effects that we have to consider. And another thing is that, as you said, once we have a market definition, we like to hold on to it. Well, in digital markets, that is not so easy because those are dynamic markets. Market boundaries are constantly changing, and that's something that we have to adapt to.
Thank you. Thank you, Nora. Vicky, we have 1 second for Nora now that has something to say. Nora, is that right?
Thank you. 1 minute, okay?
1 second,
yeah. Sorry. So that's 1 second, basically. So can I make the question now?
Sure.
So first, congratulations on the book, Vicky. There were many occasions when I wanted to ask related to developing countries, and there was Marek, I think Yasmina, and then Oles. In a way, he made me all confused, although he was great. So it's great that you are discussing this reconfiguration of the definition of the market. But have you thought maybe for the candidate countries who are still there next to the door, that are still trying to cope with the old traditional definition on the market, what they will do and what they should do, maybe? Thank you. That's all. And thanks, everybody. Bye.
Okay, thank you. So my book is on EU-US law, so I haven't actually given any thought to that. But I think the challenge, of course, for countries that are just adopting competition laws or starting to enforce it, is that, as you said, first you need to learn about market definition, and then you have to learn that actually in digital markets it doesn't work all that well. So yeah, it's a double challenge. It will not get easier, I'm afraid.
It's a parallel path. We are living the digitalization as everyone, and at the same time we must to learn what has been there. So yeah, challenging and difficult. Anyways, thank you.
Yes, that the thing we can summarize thank you, Vicky, for this very inspiring book. And that's it for today. And that's it for this discussion on your excellent book. So thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Sandra. And thank you, Daniel, to have discussed this market definition topic. You can upload like Rupert just did. And that's it also for this conference, online conference. I don't know whether Michal or Rupert want to say something at the end, but I just want to say that I'm honored and pleased to have heard all the things. I feel more intelligent now, even if it's not the case. But that's always the same with Escola. You feel like you're more intelligent after than before. So thank you all. Thank you all. And we're going to close the discussion. And to the others, and Vicky especially, pay attention to take a look at the chats, because there are excellent comments on your book also. So thank you, everyone. See you very soon, I hope. Thank you, Vicky.
Bye.
Bye-bye.